Thank you very much. It's my honor to be here to speak to you and to represent IIC. Before I get started, I wanted to share something very small with you. This is actually my 5th trip to Japan this year, and it's the 3rd trip I do for IIC collaborating in Japan. And in fact, in June, I was in this exact same building, also talking about building an ecosystem with another organization in Japan, IVNI. So IIC considers Japan a very important part of the ecosystem, a very important partner, and as you will see from my slides, it's one of the major contributors to our work. So thank you very much for having us here. I just wanted to quickly mention a few people that helped me with some of the materials in here. This is obviously a team effort. I have quite a few number of slides. The intention is not to go through all of them in detail, but I wanted to share with you a lot of the materials so that afterwards you would have it in front of you in case you wanted to have more information and questions. I'll give you a quick overview of the consortium. I will then talk about the analytics task group itself, but really I want to focus most of the time around the recently released framework and then just give you a look at what's coming ahead for analytics as well as some concluding remarks from the IIC perspective. So as has been mentioned by my colleagues previously, this is definitely a very interesting time for us to be alive in the world. It's another revolution, and we are expecting from the many different ways that you can see this, that the industrial internet and this revolution is going to be transformative. But when we look at this from an industry perspective, what we see is that there are many different barriers, whether it's along technological lines like big data, or whether it's in industry silos, or connectivity, or standards. There are many impediments to actually achieving this goal. So IIC was formed in order to help break down these barriers and bring together the global ecosystem. And again, addressing the different stumbling blocks that existed prior to this. And like some of my colleagues that have spoken before and will speak after, our focus is around the ecosystem, and I think you will hear this theme quite a bit in the presentation. Our vision is to be the world's leading organization in transforming business and society by accelerating the industrial Internet of Things, and our mission is to deliver a trustworthy industrial IoT in which the world's systems and devices are securely connected and controlled to deliver transformational outcomes. We are an open, neutral sandbox where we find industry, academia, and government meet to collaborate, innovate, and enable. This gives you just a snapshot. We have a cross-section of people that come from IT and OT. In the top left-hand corner are the current founding members and contributing members, but we also go across big industry, large industry, small industry, as well as academia, nonprofit, and government organizations. So it is a very diverse mix of stakeholders that we bring to the table. And we are over 270 members at this point. In terms of how we function perhaps a little bit different than some of the other alliances that you have seen. We tend to think of things in 3 different areas. We have Testbeds, which I will describe in more detail. We also have what we call our technical outputs, things like our reference architecture security framework, and we have a business strategy and solutions lifecycle group. And these things interplay together in a feedback loop that I will talk more about as I introduce each of these areas. In terms of how we're organized, we have a steering committee that oversees the organization, and then we have 6 major working groups where the members can participate along the lines that I discussed, that oversee task groups and contributing groups. I will briefly give you a snapshot of each working group just so you get a taste of what the organization is like, and again, the material will be available to you, which has more detail. So the technology working group, which I actually co-chair, this oversees our work on the framework, so things like our reference architecture, reference architecture, connectivity framework, recently released analytics framework is under here. Most of the work is done in the task groups. We do leverage one of the very popular standards, ISO IEC IEEE 42010, which gives you a way to describe a very complex system from an architectural framework perspective. And in each one of our frameworks, we look at the business, usage, functional, and implementation viewpoint. And when I talk about analytics, I'll give you a little bit more of a deep dive into this. Our security working group takes a look at security, not surprisingly. It looks at everything from end-to-end requirements to use cases, best practices, and also collaborates with the Testbed working group. The security framework was released last year at the end of the year and has been hugely popular around the industry. Our business solutions and strategy lifecycle group, this looks at best practices for all aspects of developing an industrial IoT system. Some of the popular work that comes out of this group is the use cases. This is actually co-chaired by Jacques Durand, who works for Fujitsu. And then we have our liaisons. So every time I make my slide, it's always old by the time I present it. So when I made this, we had 28 liaisons and 36 in flight. Today we have over 30 existing liaisons and about 40 in flight. So this is quite impressive for an organization that became 3 years old on the March 27th of this year. And you could see it's quite a collection of different groups, both geographically as well as like some of my colleagues talked about having standardization, as well as alliances and government organizations. So the mission of the liaison working group is to facilitate external interactions with the goal of building relationships, and we coordinate the internal stakeholder requests. So to give you an idea of what we do, if you look at the bottom half of this slide, we have had joint workshops. I talked about the one with IVNI that was actually in this building, one with CAICT, one with Industry 4.0 from Germany, and so on. We've also had technical workshops like NIST in the United States, participated in our meeting earlier this year in Reston. We've also been looking at SDO-focused work like ISO, IEC, JTC1, SC41, and 27 for IoT and security, as well as working on more focused areas like big data. So the IIC is actually not a standards organization. We do not develop standards. Our architectures and documents tend to be more high-level use case requirements and best practices that are used by SDOs in order to build their work. Our marketing working group is tasked with basically building a community around the work that we do. Some of the popular work that they do is they publish the Journal of Innovation, and they also have the vertical markets task groups underneath them. So some of the things, again, I will not go through this in detail, that the marketing working group does is they pull together what we call case studies. So these are member companies that pull together case studies around industrial IoT deployments. These are all available on our website. I've included a few of them as in the package of the slides so that you could take a look at them. They are very interesting, actual real case studies of how industrial IoT has been deployed. And you can see they traverse a number of different verticals in the industry. So Testbed Working Group is not surprisingly tasked with building up testbeds. So they tend to ask the question of why, how much, what are you going to do and create? And it goes through the process of bringing a testbed from an idea to operation. Before I get into what a testbed is, I just want to point out that our testbeds are not only around manufacturing, but are a number of verticals, everything from healthcare to smart cities, smart energy, and so on. And the testbeds, like the liaisons, are continuing to grow, and it's one of our busiest and most popular areas of work in IIC. So what is a testbed? A testbed is a controlled experimentation platform. Roughly speaking, it's conforming to IIC technical references where solutions can be deployed and tested in a real-world environment. As we all know from industrial IoT, one company cannot solve the entire problem or one organization. We need to build an ecosystem around this. So by the same token, when we have new ideas, being able to have a testbed to demonstrate these ideas is very important. They can include existing technologies that have not been deployed together, or they can include brand new technologies. The requirement is to have at least one member be an IIC to sponsor the testbed, but it can include non-member partners as well. So we focus on innovation. What innovations have been realized? Is there any industry impact? What best practices have been learned? Standards, what noteworthy standards have been employed? What other standards could have been employed? And then technical references. How does this affect the existing references that IIC puts out? So switching gears now to what the analytics task group does. So this is more the technical part of my talk. The analytics task group, back to the slide, is part of the technology working group. It is one of the standing task groups underneath this. This gives you an organizational chart within the technology working group. You could see industrial analytics sits alongside networking, connectivity, interoperability, architecture, and the others. I put the slide forward so that you know we don't operate in vacuum. In terms of what we do, we're really responsible for all the analytics work within IIC. And within our scope is to look at everything related to analytics and related technologies, but we also catalog different technology choices. We look at working with other working groups within IIC, as well as looking at some of the issues that come out from deploying analytics. I'm one of the co-chairs. Eric from ABB and Will from System Insights are the other two co-chairs. It's a very popular group. In terms of our work plan, earlier this year in Q1, we completed a white paper, which is available for download. At the end of the presentation, there's a slide on that. We just released in October our industrial analytics framework that I will talk more about, and we are now in the initial exploratory phase of looking at the next release of the framework. In addition to doing all of this, we also interact with other groups outside of IIC, and we bring in people into IIC. So for example, we had an expert panel that we held last year that included people from across the industry. We also participated in August this year in Ireland. It was a JTC1 Working Group 9 Big Data workshop where IIC participated from an analytics perspective. And this is something that we did also earlier this year in China, which CAICT sponsored around analytics. So what is this industrial analytics framework that I mentioned? So this is the industrial IoT analytics framework. From our perspective, we believe it's a first of its kind blueprint that addresses the entire analytics ecosystem. The target audience are decision makers, whether they come from a business or a technical background, looking to deploy a system. We provide information about the entire system, and we take into account, this is probably one of the most important things, is the industrial requirements around the deployment. We're not trying to redefine analytics, but look at how it would play in an industrial setting. And I should mention one thing here, that we use the word industrial in its classic meaning, not as just manufacturing, but rather as different industries. So to that point, what you see on the left-hand side are the main chapters within the document. You could see that the first 4 are along the viewpoints that I described. This is very consistent with our reference architecture. And then the back 4 are looking at some of the emerging technologies and trends in industrial analytics. So again, I mean, this slide gives you a little bit more detail, and it shows you the examples that I will use for each section. It is very hard to try and summarize a 60-page document in a few slides. But suffice it to say that, you know, if you think of data as the new oil, then the analytics is really the engine that propels that transformation and innovation. So again, back to that 42010 slide. Again, the first half of the document looks at a business usage, functional implementation viewpoint, and let me give you examples of that. So the business viewpoint gives you the idea from a business perspective. Why is this important? What we have seen with IT advancement is that IT now has made it further into a company's decision-making process. So it's not unusual for the CEO or the executive team of a company to look at their IT resources to see how well they are doing against their objectives. Analytics allows you to do the reverse as well. Analytics provide you insights into how your operations are going, and therefore you can use that in order to build your KPIs and objectives moving forward. So a different way to put this is this allows you to have more efficient deployment of your resources, whether they be your human capital or your industrial capital, in a more efficient fashion. And again, this goes back to the earlier presentation we saw about how this is very transformative of how economies are running. So I'll point your attention to the chart on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. This was a survey that was done. What's interesting is about 70% of business leaders identified industrial analytics as being critical for their business in the next 5 years. For something that's just emerging, it is very interesting to see that data. Switching gears into the usage viewpoints. So from here, we use the example of how one would get started, whether you come from business or a technology perspective, we divide analytics into 3 buckets: descriptive, predictive, and prescriptive. And we give you examples of how this works and what are some of the factors. Obviously, something descriptive is, here's something that's going on, here's a pattern that's going, this is what it's doing against the algorithm. Prescriptive is what you can do about it in order to achieve your objective. From a functional viewpoint, again, this goes more towards the architectural objectives and constraints. Similar to how we do our reference architecture, we divide things into control, operations, information, application, and business, and we show you how the different domains interact with each other. As an example, you could see that, for something like batch analytics is on the planning time horizon and crosses multiple domains, versus something like edge analytics operates on a machine time horizon and is really more in the control domain. The implementation viewpoint is perhaps one of the most popular areas, and this has been, rather than try to prescribe to people how to do things, we take an analytic view of how you would do this. So one of the example I wanted to share with you here is where the analytics should run. Today, the word edge and cloud are very popular. People want to be able to run them into both. So we actually think that you will have analytics running at every tier of your architecture, depending on what the business objective is. And we go through, and what you see in bold is some of the constraints that you would need in order to make the decision where it would run. What you see on the right-hand side are examples that we've gone through for each one of these and said, where would it run? Would it be in the plant, enterprise, or cloud? Switching gears into some of the emerging trends that we see, big data and artificial intelligence are some of the big things that we see today. So on the left-hand side, with AI, we go through and we give you, a description in terms of machine learning and deep learning, as well as some of the differences that you might see, and examples of how these get used and what some of the requirements are to deploy them within an industrial analytics system. On the big data side, we do something very similar. Obviously today, we don't just build compute systems just to be bigger and faster. We want to build them around the data set. So those of you familiar with CERN, CERN puts out terabytes worth of data in one shot that are studied for 10 years, versus a traffic system puts out information that is very volatile. It's not very useful if you look at it for 12 hours from now. So we look at how big data can be used within the industrial analytics perspective. In terms of analytic methods and modeling, we try to survey how this sector works. And what this slide shows you is we look at everything from how you classify algorithms to how you build them and train them and retrain them, which is something that's extremely important, and what triggers you might use for the retraining. Last but not least, this is quite a dense chart, but this shows you all the different types of outputs that IIC is doing, and the analytics is just one piece of this whole thing. So if, for example, I didn't talk about use cases, that's because use cases are being developed in our BSSL working group, and there's a different output. So we're not doing this in vacuum. So the key takeaways in terms of what we're doing with the analytics framework is we look at this as an emerging area for IT and OT convergence. Analytics is very crucial for this to be successful. This is the first blueprint of its kind to look at the entire ecosystem. It gives you a common understanding and encourages interoperability, and it takes into account the industrial requirements, goals, and cross-cutting concerns. Again, some of the terminology that you heard from some of the previous speakers. So I'd like to conclude my presentation by first telling you where we think we're going to go. So it's a very exciting time for analytics. We are definitely evangelizing. This is part of what we do, to tell you about the work that we have done. But we are also launching the 2.0 version of the framework. We're going to go deeper and broader. And we would encourage any of you to, if you're interested, to participate and be part of this effort. And last but not least, in terms of where I see the industry going, as well as how IIC is participating in this, first and foremost is it takes an ecosystem. I think you heard these in the opening remarks, and I think you'll continue to hear these from some of the other colleagues that are presenting. From my perspective on the technical side, I think big data, analytics, and IoT are 3 sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other 2. In terms to having a successful deployment of industrial analytics, we need to be looking at everything, not just the technical side, but also the business and regulatory side. What IIC is trying to do is to help build this ecosystem. I have an example here around how we bringing different partners together and what different contributors and stakeholders in the ecosystem can bring together. One of the things that we want to do with within IIC is to help enable that ecosystem so that this is more successful for everyone that's involved. With that, I think my time is up, and I would like to thank you all for your attention. There's more information to download, additional resources that are available from our website. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Diab.